Yiskadal v'yiskadash shemei rabo, bi'omor divrach erusei v'yamlich machusei, v'chayechon uvimechon v'chay dachol beis Yisrael ba'agolo v'zman korim v'yimru omein. I'm Mark Berenbach. Actually, Mark Nathan Berenbach. My first name comes from my father's father, Grandpa Max, who died a year before I was born in 1946. My middle name comes from my mom's brother, Nathan Doubleman, who, if he would have survived World War II, would have been my Uncle Natey. Nathan Doubleman was killed in combat 2 weeks before the armistice that ended World War II in Europe. He was shot and killed while on a secret mission called Task Force Baum, ordered by General George Patton. Uncle Natey and a small group of less than 300 soldiers from General Patton's Tank Corps were ordered to fight their way through 50 miles of German territory and then fight their way into a German prisoner of war camp near Hammelburg, Germany, in order to rescue Patton's captured son-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel John Waters. I didn't learn the true version of how Uncle Natey came to be killed by way of a secret combat mission until just a few years ago. I must have been 4 or 5 years old around 1950 or 51 when I first remember hearing about Uncle Natey from my parents, Mo and Bessie. They told me that Nathan, my mom's younger brother by 2 years, and only family member from her side since their parents died in the early 1930s, was killed almost by accident while riding in a tank somewhere in France. From what little information the United States War Department shared with the next of kin, my mother, the story went something like this. On or around March 27th, 1945, Natey, then a 29-year-old enlistee, and by then a sergeant, was riding in the open turret of a tank with the driver. As part of General Patton's Tank Corps, they were crossing France on their way to Germany in the closing days of the war in Europe. Apparently, a German sniper shot at the driver, and so goes the story, the bullet ricocheted off his helmet and struck Uncle Natey. As a child listening to this, I was riveted. I was scared. And I was mystified how something so awful could happen so quickly. At that time, the only uncle I had was my Uncle Joe, my father's brother. Uncle Joe was unquestionably my favorite, and I adored him. He brought us kids candy and loose change, and his quiet, friendly, and smiling demeanor made it great when he came to visit, or we went to visit him and Grandma Berenbach in Passaic. So you can imagine finding out about Natey's death was a sad and very scary moment for me. It was only later in life that I could appreciate how sad and tragic it must have been for my mother. While working in Washington, D.C., I was able to track down exactly where Natey was buried, and also, as his family member, I requested the complete and unredacted military record. Fortunately, I had decided to give myself a present for my upcoming retirement after working for 30 years for the United States government. My gift to me was to take my wife and my sister, who you will meet in person, and who, as a little girl, had known her Uncle Natey before he left Passaic for World War II to visit his grave outside the village of Sonnenwald at the Lorraine American Cemetery.
I really don't remember much about Uncle Natey because I was a little girl, less than 4 when he left. I always liked him because he was so nice and had such a sweet smile. He had dark, wavy hair. He and my mother were close, and later I found out that their parents died when they were young. So Natey and my mother took care of each other.
A story I do remember is of my sister and my father telling me that almost all of my mother's family were murdered during World War II. Many of them lived in a village in what was then called White Russia, near Poland, when the Nazis invaded at the outset of World War II. A cousin of my mother, who survived, and my parents sponsored from a displaced persons camp in Europe, and who I remember meeting, told them how our family, with all the other Jews of the village, were rounded up and shot standing along a ditch by the road. On a happier note, Moshe and Chana Dubrovitz, or Dubrovich, landed at Ellis Island in New York Harbor in 1906 on a ship from what U.S. Customs called Russia Poland. Moshe, born in 1878, was about 28 years old when he arrived in America. His wife, Chana, born in 1889, was about 19 years old. The one story I do remember my mother telling us kids was that her parents did not speak any English when they arrived in the United States. When they landed at Ellis Island and left the ship, they had to appear before an immigration official who then had to interview them. Apparently, the customs officer did not speak either Russian or Yiddish. He had a hard time understanding their names and ended up writing down Morris for Moshe, Anna for Chana, and gave them a new last name of Doubleman. Not knowing what he was talking about and being afraid of being rejected and sent back, they smiled and nodded at him and took their new American names that they later found out about. The 1920 census lists Bessie as 6 years old, born March 12th, 1913, and Nathan, 4.5 years old, having been born August 31st, 1915. The census taker for the 1920 census changed Anna's name to Annie. My mother said that her parents never liked or learned English well. She and Nathan spoke Yiddish with them at home and English at school and with their friends. Unfortunately, Anna died on November 20th, 1932, at 43 years of age. Morris quickly followed and passed away on February 24th, 1933, barely 3 months later. This left a 19-year-old Bessie and her 17-year-old brother Nathan to fend for themselves. I haven't been able to find out why or how Moshe and Chana died. Some time on the internet shows that flu epidemics in the winter months were still prevalent in the early 1930s. Healthcare, especially for the poor and working classes, was scarce and out of most people's reach. Once I got hold of Natey's military record, I saw that there really wasn't much detail there. I was notified that, unfortunately, some of his record was destroyed in a large and very damaging fire in 1973 in St. Louis, Missouri. So, how could I find out more details about Natey's military experience? The records I did get told me he served in the 4th Armored Division. The internet showed there was a veterans organization for the 4th Armored Division nationally, and there was a New York City chapter. Taking a chance, I wrote a letter and sent it to the chapter in New York City. I told them who I was and asked if anyone had known Natey and could give me some information. I received a reply within a month from the Secretary-Treasurer of the New York City chapter, a fine fellow by the name of Harry Feinberg. Harry knew Uncle Natey and, it turned out, was a close friend.
Dear Mark, I received my Rolling Together magazine the other day and read your request for information about your Uncle Sergeant Nate Doubleman. Natey, as I called him, and I were inducted together January 14th, 1942, and were sent to Fort Dix, New Jersey for a week, and then on to Fort Knox, Kentucky for 3 months of armor basic training. On April 15th, we returned to Pine Camp, New York, to our permanent outfit, the 4th Armored Division. I went to Headquarters Company, and Natey went to C Company, both in the 37th Tank Regiment. Natey and I got to know each other and hung out together whenever we could. We were both from New Jersey, I from Passaic, and I'm not sure where Natey was from. I guess would be Newark. You would probably know more about that through your family. Natey was one grand person, always smiling, always had a funny quip, no matter what the situation, never a bad word about or against anyone. His wife came to visit him while we were stationed at Camp Bowie in Texas prior to going overseas. I can't recall her name or even what she looked like, as I saw her only a few times while we were in Brownwood. I left them alone as we all knew the big move was coming shortly. We shipped out to Swansea, Wales, and then to De Vries, England, where we were in training for 6 months before our move into Europe.
The next part of Harry's letter changed everything.
Natey was on a task force apart from the 4th Armored's mission when he was killed. Old Blood and Guts Patton had gotten word that his son-in-law was a POW in a compound in Hammelburg, Germany, and he detailed Company C and the 10th Infantry to make up a task force to go and liberate these men. This understaffed unit rode like the wind, took a beating, and after they reached the compound, were captured. I got word from some of the boys who escaped and came back to our outfit that Natey was standing in his bow gunner's seat while making the attack, and a sniper got him. If he had been seated behind tank armor, he would have been alive today. We'll just never know. It has been 50 years, and my brain hasn't retained all the terrible incidents, fortunately. Right now, all I can say is that if you had known your Uncle Natey, you would have loved him. You could be proud of such a grand person.
Except for a few entries in Natey's existing record about training, there is nothing about his exploits crossing France and Germany or any mention of Task Force Baum. A few websites I visited mentioned Task Force Baum and referred to 2 books in particular. The most personal is Raid, The Untold Story of Patton's Secret Mission. Published in 1981, it was jointly written by Richard Barron, Abraham Baum, yes, the Major Abe Baum of Task Force Baum, and Richard Goldhurst. The other book, Patton's Last Gamble, was published in 2018 and authored by Dwayne Schultz, who has written more than a dozen military histories. Both are well written and provide all the what, where, when, and why. Both books can't help but confront the outsized personality of George Patton and speculate why he would concoct such a misadventure with the clock of World War II almost wound down. The authors speculate on Patton's desire to not only rescue his son-in-law, but to give his own image a boost at the end of what might be his last war. I had the opportunity to see my old friend and military historian, Ian Kemp. Ian, a combat veteran from Vietnam, has spent considerable time looking into Task Force Baum.
Task Force Baum was the brainchild of General George Patton. Near the end of March 1945, after having crossed into Germany, Patton received word that his son-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, captured in early 1943 in the North Africa campaign, was moved to the German prison camp Stalag Luft 13, outside of Hammelburg, Germany. At this time, Patton's forces, having crossed the Rhine River, were about 50 miles from Hammelburg near Aschaffenburg. He wrote to his wife Beatrice to tell her the news of Colonel Waters' whereabouts and to say he might be able to send a small expedition to rescue him.
So, in a nutshell, just under 300 enlisted men and their field officers, with their tanks and other equipment, were hastily put together with no pre-planning or input from the participants. Only a few of Patton's officers knew of the mission, and the enlisted men, like Natey, had no knowledge of what was being asked of them.
So under the guise of a plan to rescue approximately 200 American prisoners, Patton ordered his tip of the spear, as he liked to call them, a small number of companies of the 3rd Army, 4th Armoured Division, numbering just 294 enlisted men and their officers in 53 vehicles. Orders were to leave the middle of the night under the cover of darkness, cross 50 miles of German territory and attack and break into Stalag 13, repatriate these American prisoners and drive back to American Army lines. Also accompanying Task Force Baum was General Patton's aide, Major Alexander Stiller. It later was obvious, despite General Patton's denial, that the target of and the reason for the rescue was Lieutenant Colonel Waters, and that Major Stiller, not at all a combatant, was ordered by Patton to go along because he knew John Waters and could identify him when they reached Stalag 13.
There were a few maps of the 50 miles they were going to have to cross, none of them with any real detail. They had a general idea where Hammelburg was, but no real idea where the POW camp was located. They had enough fuel to get there, but not enough for the round trip. Patton told his officers to ask the local citizens for directions and to somehow forage enough fuel from the locals to get back to the American lines. The reality was that this relatively small convoy ran into stiff and deadly opposition from the outset. With a number of starts and stops, delays to move destroyed vehicles, and getting lost because of poor directions, they had no benefit of surprise or darkness. As it turned out, German spotter planes picked up the task force early and tracked their progress, radioing their position to the ground forces. In twice the time it was planned to take, they found Hammelburg and the POW camp.
Those not killed in the raid were wounded and captured by German forces. All of the vehicles and equipment were destroyed or taken. A few avoided capture and made their way to Allied lines. 2 weeks later, following the armistice that ended World War II in Europe, a much larger American Army force liberated Stalag 13. They found over 3,000 prisoners, many from Russia and other countries at war with Germany. Lieutenant Colonel Waters had been shot and seriously wounded in Task Force Baum's raid, but survived and was liberated with all the other prisoners. General Patton continued to deny that the primary reason for sending Task Force Baum to Stalag 13 was to rescue his son-in-law.
A very few brief accounts of what happened leaked out initially, but the commanding officers, Generals Eisenhower and Omar Bradley, were embarrassed and angered by Patton's actions and did not want to publicize the botched raid. So now I had lots of questions. What was it like to fight your way through Bavaria and then attack a Nazi prisoner of war camp? If I was going to have any idea of what it looked like to Natey, even after almost 75 years, I figured I should go to Germany and see what I could see. More stories on the internet about Hammelburg and the German army base that was the prisoner of war camp indicated that remarkably little had changed since the end of World War II. My son, Aaron Joseph, yes, he is named after Uncle Joe, is a great driver and took a year of German in high school. So he is perfect and agreed to accompany me on this mission. Fortunately, no troop ship for us. On June 17, 2019, Aaron and I take an Alaska Airlines flight to Seattle. Then a 10-hour flight over Canada, across the Atlantic, and straight to Frankfurt, Germany. Natey, no doubt, went on a landing craft to the beaches of Normandy to start the journey through France and into Germany. We got off the plane, we walked through customs, and found the car rental counter to claim our reservation. 75 years sure makes a big difference in how we get from one part of the planet to another. Task Force Baum had only a crude map to find their way from Aschenberg to Hammelburg. I printed multiple Google maps complete with construction information and alternate routes to get to Hammelburg. Task Force Baum wound along narrow roads in a M4 Sherman tank, trucks, and jeeps with a top speed of around 35 miles per hour. They crawled through small villages, past farms, along muddy paths, and through Bavarian forests. Our snazzy new Renault Clio whizzed along superhighways, the Autobahn, at 75 miles per hour. So far, it seems like two different worlds. But as we got into the foothills of Bavaria and left the Autobahn, our sense of time and place seemed to shift. The narrow two-lane roads, especially through the small villages, the lush green hills and valleys stretching out around us, the fields laid out with German precision, and the overarching quiet created a sense of timelessness. We knew it was today, but it could have been yesterday or yesteryear. Through a travel booking website, I found an old inn just down the road a few miles from Hammelburg for us to stay at. It is a lovely looking and well-kept family-run place with simple but comfortable rooms, a restaurant and beer garden. Hammelburg is not just old. Hammelburg is very old. dating back to 716 AD, and developed over the centuries as a military fortress of strategic importance. Initially, it was part of the line of defense against the Mongol hordes trying to invade from the northern mountains. Kings and rulers came and left, and the population, currently about 11,000, are very proud of their history. Hammelburg in June is a lovely and inviting local tourist destination. Local wines are popular and prominent. Hiking trails with restored and abandoned castles are popular. We wandered through the town center on a warm, sunny morning. The well-kept, narrow streets are dotted with beautiful old and renovated buildings. Unlike so many other areas of Germany, Hammelburg was virtually untouched by Allied bombing and combat, so much of its infrastructure was untouched. A few miles south of Hammelburg is the current iteration of the army base that served as a prisoner of war camp during both World War I and World War II. Today, the base is a very secure infantry training facility for the German army. During World War I, it used part of the camp to house captured military prisoners from other European countries. From 1920 until 1930, it was converted into a children's home run by Benedictine nuns. From 1930 onward, it returned to being used as a military training base. And by 1938, it specialized in artillery training and absorbed a few of the local villages for target practice. By 1940, the first prisoners of World War II arrived here. These were Dutch, Belgian, and French captured military personnel. By 1941, Serbian, Polish, and Russians started to arrive. Next came the British, Australian, and other British Commonwealth country prisoners. By December of 1944, following the Battle of the Bulge, American prisoners started to be housed there. Lieutenant Colonel John Waters arrived here in March 1945, transferred with other American prisoners from other camps due to the Allied assault. The base is ringed by high fences. The main gate really does look like it did in 1945 and appeared very secure, with no traffic in or out that I could see. As we drove around, I thought I saw the road to the Prisoner of War Memorial from the pictures on the internet. And not far from there, a pathway leading to it. Finally, on our own, we found the Prisoner of War Cemetery. In a less than well taken care of condition, what should be sacred ground was overrun by weeds and neglect. I realized I was standing on a mass grave. Officially, all Americans, British, Commonwealth countries, French, and Belgians have been returned to their homelands. The cemetery officially holds 3,031 Russian soldiers, 44 from World War I, 75 Yugoslavs, and 35 Poles. 3,000 Russian men is a lot of men to have died in captivity. The numbers are only estimates, probably a minimum, because these bodies have never been exhumed. How many men and from where will probably never be known. Especially toward the end of World War II, conditions at the camp for everyone, guards and prisoners alike, were dreadful. 1945 was a very cold winter. Rations were in very short supply. Morale was low, and I imagine human kindness was in short supply as well. Overall, 30,000 prisoners of war, with Russians as the largest group, were held at Stalag Luft 13C. I learned as a side note that the eldest son of Russian leader Joseph Stalin, Yakov, an artillery officer and engineer, was captured and briefly held at Stalag 13C until he was moved to another prisoner of war camp, and he eventually also died in captivity. I don't know where Natey was initially buried at Stalag 13C. There was no graves registry like at the Lorraine Cemetery to denote a grave and its location.
I was 7 when my mother told me that Uncle Natey wasn't coming home. Natey was shot by a German soldier, but she didn't know the details. I remember staying home with my brothers while our parents talked to a rabbi about what they should do with Uncle Natey's body. They had to decide if they wanted him brought home or buried in France. The rabbi said Jewish law stated the dead should be buried as soon as possible. Even though Uncle Natey had been dead for weeks or months before we knew, the rabbi said it would be better to bury him sooner in the military cemetery in France. So that's what my parents decided. I'm sorry they didn't bring Uncle Natey home.
I can imagine his being tossed into a hole in the ground, naked, and no identification, which is how his body was found. The forensic identification reports found approximately 16 pounds of Natey's remains. Fortunately, his teeth were found with him, and his Army dental records were key in making a definite identification. He was reburied on February 21st, 1946.
He was such a nice person. I felt so bad for my mother. Uncle Natey was the only family she had after her parents died. And then she didn't have him either. Talking about him like this reminds me how much I still miss him.
Another report listed his personal possessions as one personal letter, one penknife, a 2-franc coin, a birthstone ring, and a wedding band. Prior to leaving the United States for Europe, Natey married. I never met Hannah, but I sure wish I had. My sister, who spoke with her some years later, said that Hannah remarried. There is also a report in Natey's file of her turning over her next of kin status to my mother. I can only imagine the grief she went through, finding out that her new husband was not coming home. Natey was awarded 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star. Oh, one more thing. I looked high and low to find out what the B in Nathan B. Doubleman, that appears in all of Natey's military records, stands for. I never heard while I was growing up that Natey had a middle name. I know that my mother did not have a middle name. My father and Uncle Joe did not have middle names. The most important names that immigrant Jewish parents gave to their children were their Hebrew names. I know that it was fashionable among some children of Jewish immigrants in adulthood to give themselves a middle name or an initial. So my educated guess is that Natey, when he went down to the enlistment center to sign up back in 1942, gave himself a middle initial to show that he was just as much an American as everyone else. God bless Uncle Natey. What can I say I discovered from this journey? From a little boy's wonder to an old man's visit to grave sites almost forgotten. I think I learned at least two things from all these records, talking to people and visiting some of the places that Natey visited. Number one is that Natey was a good man who stepped up when war against the United States was declared in late 1941. He volunteered in early 1942 for the duration of the war. He literally gave himself to protect and defend his country, the country his parents came to. And second, as in all wars, some combatants get killed for some very bad reasons. The orders given and the battle plans drawn up can be debated this way and that for eternity. But the results are always the same. Some survive, some don't. Natey's story is chock full of irony on so many levels. I think his story may be representative of the many Nateys, the uncles, the fathers, and the brothers who quietly and with no fanfare gave their lives for a just cause. I hope this story helps others to discover their own Nateys and the bravery and sacrifices made. Our global internet now gives us all access to search for information and details that we may never have known. I am grateful that my mother Bessie and my father Mo gave me the middle name Nathan to carry through my life, to remind me from where and from whom I came from. Natey's burial at Stalag 13 in 1945 and his reburial at the Lorraine Cemetery in February of 1946 had no semblance of a Jewish funeral service. In fact, the U.S. Army initially gave Natey's gravesite a cross rather than a Star of David. The traditional prayer said at a Jewish funeral gravesite is the mourner's Kaddish. Although this prayer never actually mentions death, it is the time-honored prayer to honor and remember a deceased loved one. Traditionally, it is said with a quorum or a minyan of at least 10 adults. In Orthodox Judaism, 10 men who have been bar mitzvahed. As Natey is eternally surrounded by thousands of his fellow soldiers, I think it might be okay with our Lord if we count them as our minyan. We say today what didn't get said 75 years ago. Oseh shalom b'mavra hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yimeru. Amen.
waters will your poor heart freeze? Sleep away the darkness till spring. Seasons change, we change too. Will it look the same when skies aren't blue? Will all these things we say